Hi everyone, today we're going to be discussing Chapter 2. This chapter has to do with medication development, regulations, and resources. We're going to go through and define some terms and abbreviations, talk about international, federal, state, and local roles in regulating drugs, talk about the Joint Commission. We're going to talk a little bit about drug development and testing, and describe pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics. We'll also look at some different medication labels, talk about some different important things on there, and then we're also going to talk about some different resources where you can find medication information. So first we want to mention international laws. The WHO is an agency of the United Nations. It's the World Health Organization. They don't actually enforce laws concerning drugs because this is different from country to country. Some countries are going to have really strict laws and others are not as strict, but they do publish the World Health Report and guidelines for safe surgery, which is pertinent to you guys. The role of federal and state agencies are going to be distinct and impact surgical technology in different ways. For example, state practice acts are going to govern who orders drugs, who dispenses them, and then the administration of these. And this will be different from state to state. So back to federal laws. One of the earliest federal efforts for regulation and consumer protection was the Pure Food and Drug Act. This was in 1906. It required all drugs in the U.S. to meet minimum standards of uniform strength, purity, and quality. A big thing that came from this is proper labeling of medications. Another important federal law is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and this actually started in 1938. It required animal testing of medications to prove drugs' effectiveness, and also accurate labels that included generic names. You also, with this law, have to have cautions about the drug's ability to cause drowsiness or become habit-forming, some of those alerts that we still see on our medications today. Another federal law was the Durham-Humphrey Amendments from 1952. These restricted the dispensing of some medications and then established the over-the-counter category for others. So basically the prescription drugs would require a physician to order them, and then the over-the-counter drugs don't require that. The Controlled Substances Act was established in 1970. So this basically just puts classifications on drugs and kind of tells you how much abuse potential they have. Also, it focuses on medicinal uses. So this created 5 different schedules of drugs. If you want, you can look at your book, Table 2-1, and it'll summarize the substance schedules for you. We'll go into this in a little more detail, but this was the reason for the establishment of the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Agency. So the first schedule of controlled substances is C1 drugs. Examples of these would be LSD, heroin, PCP. These have a high potential for abuse, and there's not actually any accepted medical use. They're only researched. The next schedule of controlled substances are C2 substances. Examples of this are going to be fentanyl, cocaine, morphine, opium, codeine, all of those types of things. They're classified as such because they have a high abuse potential, but they can be appropriate for medical use in the right situations. Now, you probably saw the cocaine example on here, and are a little bit confused by that. It is an illegal substance, but there are times when this can be used in surgery. For example, maybe somebody is having a sinus surgery. The doctor can actually either use liquid cocaine or cocaine flakes, and they'll dip a long cotton swab type thing on them, and they'll apply this to the nasal passages. What this does is it helps to numb the area, and the biggest purpose is it really helps with bleeding. It's going to constrict blood vessels, so they're not going to get a lot of bleeding when they're working in those areas. I used to see this when I worked at a surgery center. Doctors would use this. But now where I'm at, I actually have never seen this available. But so it might just depend on the facility. But again, it would be a C2 drug. C3, 4, and 5 drugs are medically accepted for use. The C3 drugs are going to have a moderate abuse potential, and then the 4 and 5 have a low abuse potential, so it's probably not going to happen that those are going to get used in the wrong way. The Controlled Substances Act, like I mentioned, is controlled by the DEA, which is just one federal agency that's going to help regulate medications. The DEA is a division of the Department of Justice, and it was established in 1973. Another thing with this Controlled Substances Act, it did set standards for handling controlled substances. So there's going to be pretty good records in place for the use of narcotics, and physicians have to have a DEA number to track the prescriptions on their controlled substances so that they can make sure that they aren't prescribing in the wrong way. So these DEA requirements help safeguard drug control and consumer safety, along with institutional policies and procedures that are going to determine how drugs are handled and stored. These have to, at minimum, comply with DEA standards, but they may also have extra practices put in place. You may hear the term narcotics used or opioids. They're kind of interchangeable. And it's just important that there's careful record keeping. So you want to make sure there's a patient name associated with the drug that you're giving, the date that it's being given, the person obtaining it. Is it a nurse? Is it an anesthesiologist? And then who is administering that drug. Also, if there's any leftover drugs, that needs to be charted, and they'll have to have 2 people do what's called wasting of the narcotics. So you'll have typically, if an anesthesiologist doesn't use all of one of these drugs, a nurse will have to witness them disposing of it properly and sign off that that did happen. So there are some federal agencies out there that help to play roles in medication regulation. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They set standards that help ensure all workers' health and safety. Their parent organization is the U.S. Department of Labor. Probably one of the biggest things that's going to affect you guys in surgical technologist practice is the 2001 Occupational Exposure to Bloodborne Pathogens Standard. So this basically helps to keep us safe and have protocols in place in the event that we are exposed to a bloodborne pathogen. So OSHA sets the standard that requires employers to provide a follow-up plan that adheres to the CDC guidelines for exposure to bloodborne pathogens. So basically post-exposure treatment and follow-up guidelines. The CDC is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They're part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They're the leading federal agency for protecting health and safety of people, and they also provide credible information to enhance health decisions. So they have a different parent organization, but they do help regulate medications. Another federal law is the CDC prophylactic policy for post-exposure events. So for example, if you get stuck by a needle in surgery, something like that, and you're exposed to an at-risk individual, then there's some certain procedures in place that are going to help protect you guys and how this should be handled. This was created in 1995, so this is just going to be really important for basically us and any other at-risk healthcare workers. So the CDC will recommend that people will receive these prophylactic medications within 2 hours of exposure to a bloodborne pathogen, whether that is AIDS, hepatitis, something like that. They have set protocols in place. So now we're going to look more at the state level and what their practice acts entail. So this will actually govern ordering, dispensing, and administration of medications. There may be extra laws in place, but they overall still have to comply with federal regulations. Prescribers can differ from state to state. Here in Indiana, doctors, NPs, PAs, all of them can prescribe medications. So it's pretty widespread versus other states where perhaps NPs and PAs can't prescribe or can only prescribe certain levels of controlled substances. So under state practice acts, physicians may prescribe drugs, but they can also delegate that power to other parties. So that's how they are able to allow NPs and PAs to do this as well. So they don't have unlimited power, This is something that they can give to basically certain individuals that have some certain credentials in place. Medical licensing boards kind of control this. In surgery, we act as extenders to the physician, so we're kind of their extra pair of hands, and that's how we're able to handle medications like we do. It's just important that you guys know your state's specific practice acts. So if you're going to go practice surgical technology somewhere else, make sure you are aware of what you can and cannot do, because they will vary widely what you can do. So there are legal standards that you have to operate within. If your state laws don't specifically address surgical technology, use policies set forth in your hospital to determine your scope of practice. The Joint Commission, this is going to be a term that you hear a lot when you are in healthcare. They evaluate and accredit more than 20,500 healthcare organizations and programs in the U.S. They're going to set some different standards and goals. Big thing that comes from this are the National Patient Safety Goals. These are established annually and address issues like infection control, universal protocol for preventing wrong site, wrong procedure, wrong person surgery, and medical errors. So this is a big focus. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more, Joint Commission, when we get together this week in class. Another thing that they have implemented a guide on surgical site infections. We'll talk more about surgical site infections when we talk about the antibiotics chapter, but it's something that we really want to limit how often that's happening. Also, the Joint Commission, so like I mentioned already, they're going to set standards and they accreditate healthcare agencies. One thing that they put in place was in 2004, they came up with the do not use list of terms and abbreviations. You can look at your book and see a better visual of this. It's pretty hard to see here, but it's going to be table 2.2. So there's some things here you're going to see that's a good idea not to use when you're writing out shorthand for some abbreviations. There's also the Institute for Safe Medication Practices that has a list of error-prone abbreviations that you want to avoid when talking about different drugs. So drug development, we're going to talk about this for a little bit. The FDA oversees development of drugs, and they set some basic standards. They're basically going to test everything, make sure the drugs are going to be effective and safe. So the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research regulates the pharmaceutical industry. You can see this table, it's 2-3 in your book. It'll show you different pregnancy categories, and basically this is just useful to when you're taking care of a pregnant patient and a doctor is trying to determine if it's safe for them to receive a certain medication, they have these drugs grouped into different categories. So a category A drug, this is going to have no risk to the fetus based on the studies that have been done, all the way down to B, C, and D. So maybe as you get down to D, it's going to be more of a risk that's proven. So you have to kind of outweigh the risk versus benefit. And then on the last one, the category X, this shows that there is a definite risk to the fetus. The risk is going to outweigh the benefit, so you don't want to give this drug at all during pregnancy. So when we're talking about terms of drug testing, the FDA has devised a system for achieving approval. So this process initially is going to begin with animals. They'll take 2 species of mammals, both genders, and they're just going to look for toxicity of the medication and try to determine what a safe dose would be. So only 5 in 5,000 drugs that enter preclinical testing actually move on to testing in humans. So you can see it's a very, very limited amount of drugs that even move on from this first stage. So once the medication is proven safe in animals, it's going to move on to human testing. So you can see 2 phases of the testing, including the most recent designation, which is phase 0. So this is microdosing, very, very small doses given to humans, and it's designed to speed up development of drugs. After that, stage 1, this is where they're going to seek healthy male volunteers, and this will again help to determine toxicity in the dose in humans versus animals this time. The second phase is going to be clinical investigation. This is a limited number of patients. It's going to be about several hundred people. This can typically last from 1 to 3 years, and it's going to be given to people that actually have the disease. It'll determine the effectiveness of the drug and the optimal dosage. The third phase is going to involve clinical trials. So the drug will move to this stage if there's been no serious side effects previously. And then they may have double-blind studies in this phase where half of the test group of patients are going to be given the test drug and the other half receives a placebo, sugar pill, something that is not an active drug. And this phase is going to last for several years. They're going to research and study the drug, and it'll determine safety, effectiveness, and any side effects of the drug. The fourth phase concludes testing with post-marketing studies. So they're going to continue to monitor the medication through results that they've gathered from prescribing physicians. And then all the data that they've gathered will be reported to the FDA. So moving on from that, we want to talk about pharmacogenetics. This is the study of genetic factors in predicting a medication's action and how it could vary from its intended response. It's basically one technological advancement in medicine recently. It's important because different people have different genetic makeups, and so therefore you may respond differently to medications and therapies. So it's very individualized. Pharmacogenomics refers to the general study of all genes that determine medication behavior. These two terms will be interchangeably used a lot. It's pretty much identical to pharmacogenetics. So pharmacogenomics creates medications based on the human genome. So it's going to help develop some possible new medications, revive some old medications for new purposes, and then it's going to facilitate the approval process. The distinct advantages for this are drug markers may be able to help target specific diseases, and it can reduce the cost and risk of clinical trials because they're better tailored to certain individuals. If you want, you can always look at more information on here at the National Institute of Health's website. There are also disadvantages to pharmacogenomics. It is very complex science, it's high cost, and it's really hard to get professionals trained in this field. It is very specific, so we're pretty limited on how we can use this so far. During development of a drug, the drug company assigns a generic name to it, so it's selected by the manufacturer after FDA approval, and it's used for marketing purposes. The USP and National Formulary assigns the official name, and that's going to give the manufacturer exclusive rights to market it for 20 years. That's basically a patent on the drug that gives them exclusive rights. Typically, brand names of medications are going to be really well known, and keep in mind that the patent for drugs is usually issued before the clinical trials begin, and we already looked at how long that can take. So the drug time of the patent, when the drug is actually available to be used, may only be for 7 to 12 years versus that 20, because it may be taken anywhere from 8 to 13 years to get it through the trials. We're going to look a little bit here at medication labeling. So the brand name is also known as the trade name or proprietary name. It's always going to be capitalized on a label, and then it also may be in large or bold type. It'll also be followed by the registered symbol, that circle with the R in it, indicating that the name and formula are registered. So if you look on here, you can see ANSEF, it's that big bold type. Granted, everything on here is capitalized in that particular part of the label, but you can see the registered sign after it, and ANSEF is the big bold word. So that's how you know it is the brand name. And just remember too, when you're giving medications, you guys are going to be the last checkpoint before the surgeon administers it. So it's important to know what you are handling. So we already mentioned a drug may also be known as its generic name, which is non-proprietary. It's selected by the manufacturer in development. Lowercase letters, you'll see this on some labels, it may be in parentheses, and it's not going to be owned by any company. So I mentioned already the label on here on this Ancef brand name, cefazolin is the generic name. It is capitalized. You can see all the letters are capitalized, but it's not in big bold type, and you do not see that registered symbol after that. Another way to identify drugs are by its chemical name. So this is going to precisely describe chemical composition and molecular structure of drugs. You're not going to be responsible for knowing these. They're typically not on the label of the medication either. It's really going to only be used by chemists. So when we're looking at labels, which we're going to look at a bunch together in class to help you kind of decipher what everything is, you're going to find a bunch of different items on there. Usually these items here are going to be pretty prominent on the medication label. The brand name, generic name, manufacturer's name, the dosage strength, and the form. All of those should be pretty easy to find. On this specific medication, you can see it's called Ciprodex is the brand name. I can't really see on here how it's so small for me to say the generic. It is a sterile otic suspension, so that's going to be the form. We talked about suspensions already. And then Alcon is the manufacturer. And again, I can't see the concentration to tell you what the strength is because it's so small on that label. Other information found on the labels, supply dosage, that's going to be read basically as X measured units per quantity. On this label, example would be the 1,000 units of heparin per milliliter. That's in the parentheses underneath. Total volume, you'll be able to see this one is 10 ml. Any label alerts on here, maybe refrigerate, shake well before use, those would be included, and the expiration date. All prescription medications should be used, discarded, or returned to the pharmacy by the expiration date, which you guys are going to really focus on expiration dates when you're receiving medications on your sterile field. You may also see lot or control numbers on drugs, barcode symbols, the National Drug Code, which is going to start with that NDC and a bunch of different numbers. That is required by federal law to be on there. And you may see the USP and NF number on there. And then you can see in your textbook, if you want to look at labels, you can see examples of lot number, barcode, and NDC. Next up are medication references. The first is the Physician's Desk Reference, or PDR. This is a pretty common source that provides information on thousands of medications. It's updated annually. The information inside is the same as what's provided in manufacturer's packaging inserts. So the things that you'd get at home for antibiotics, it's going to be contained in this reference. The USPNF, this is popular among drug companies and pharmacists, and it's the official medication list recognized by the U.S. government. There's a couple other references you can use. The American Hospital Formulary Service, the medical letter, facts and comparisons, and a hospital pharmacist. So these all have unique applications as well. The AHFS is considered unbiased because pharmaceutical companies aren't the sole source of information for these. And then the facts and comparisons includes comparison charts and tables for thousands of prescription and over-the-counter medications. There's also some unconventional publications that can be a source for medication information. Databases and the internet are going to offer a lot of information as well. The important thing is just to be sure that the website has contains reliable information. You know, anybody can post on the internet, so just make sure you're verifying this information from at least 2 different sources. So after this, we will go over some medications together, and when we meet as a group, I just want to look at some drug labels, and we'll kind of go through that, look at brand names, generic names, and all of that. So be sure to write down any questions you have.